We now will shift our focus from architecture to the visual arts as we celebrate a towering figure in modern Indian art. The Boy from Crawford Market, a centenary tribute to F.N. Souza, marks 100 years since the birth of the legendary artist. Tonight we are privileged to explore the life and work of this revolutionary figure, from his humble beginnings in Saligao in Goa to his meteoric rise in the international art world. Souza's journey embodies boldness, innovation, and an unwavering artistic vision. Please join me in welcoming co-founder, co-director of the Goa Arts and Literature Festival, Vivek Menezes, gallerist and owner, Pandols, Dadiba Pandol, and editor, Art India, and author of The Catalyst, Rudy von Leyden's, and India's Artistic Awakening, Rima Desai-Gihai, who will explore Souza's unique style and profound impact on modern art. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rima and Dadiba, for being here. But really, I'd like to start by thanking Asad, Lalji, and team for this entire exuberant and well-conceived Festa de Goa, and in this really gorgeous monument to the heyday of the very specific cosmopolitanism that made Bombay so very special in the first half of the 20th century. And here, it's a little hard to see right now, but I was looking from the back earlier. Seeing all of you here, it really feels a little bit like that lovely cultural history that we're going to be talking about and that we have been talking about is very much alive. But there's another and perhaps a bit more personal thanks. I'd also like to I'd like to extend thanks to Asad and his team, which is the opportunity to celebrate Francis Newton Souza's 100th birthday very close to the places that made him, and in this city where this meteoric talent first emerged, and where he eventually was buried, but never saw or experienced the kind of celebrity status or monetary reward that is now ostensibly his worth, and this name recognition you have in a place like this. We'll get to some of the contradictions and controversies and the auction records and the fakes, but I'm actually very glad today because on his 100th, in his centenary year, I'm able to talk to these two people. Dadiba knew Souza well, as did I, and especially with Rima, whose excellent new book, which we'll also talk about, has just been released, is about Rudy von Leyden and his family in Bombay, and can give us an invaluable context about the Boy from Crawford Market. This is a painting from very, very early on in Souza's career when he was really very much a Bombay person, and this is the kind of artist that he began as, and then who became really, as in that oft-repeated cliche, the enfant terrible of the Indian art world. Rima, here's the cover of your book. Big hand, please, for Rima's The Catalyst. We'll get to it. We started with this, and then in 1949 comes this, which is, is this 46 as well? Okay, it's 46 as well. I actually didn't. So this is another side of Souza at exactly the same time. And by the 49, you have the founding of the progressive artist movement. How would you situate what happened? What was happening in the 40s that took an artist like Souza and made him so significant? What was the milieu? Can you describe the milieu, which is also the milieu in your book?
47 is when India became independent. And I think while it was a bloody partition in every sense, I think the narrative of a new India fell on the writers, the artists, the poets, and the creative minds. And it was an exciting time. And I think somewhere the progressives, they built upon this narrative. These wonderful artists. Souza, in fact, left or was asked to leave from JJ School of Art in 42. He, along with Raza and Ara, Raza went to JJ, but Ara was a self-taught painter, and they invited Hussain, Bakre. Souza chose Hussain, Raza chose, yeah.
Raza chose Gade and Ara chose Bakre.
Correct. And they wanted to, again, break away from the academic art that they were taught in art school. And that's where the art kind of fit into that narrative. And create art that was, yes, that was theirs.
Souza remembers a little later. It's quite, I thought it may be interesting to read this. This is what the manifesto for the Progressive Artist Group was. Well, it wasn't a manifesto, it's what Souza recalls later in 1984. He said, I had begun to notice the JJ School of Art turned out an awful number of bad artists year after year. And the Bombay Art Society showed awful crap in its annual exhibitions, which comprised the amateur efforts of some meme sahibs in India who were pampered by British imperialism. Hence, this pretty painting, together with the work of several artists coming out of the art school exhibited once a year, had no direction, no goal, no inspiration, no energy. It then occurred to me to form a group to give ourselves an incentive. There's a particularly interesting thing that happens with the progressive, because you have this kind of a modernism of record is taking place in Shantiniketan, you know, with a kind of a saintly-looking, sadhu-looking Indian intellectuals, and then you have this decidedly like kind of heterogeneous group of subalterns coming out of Bombay. You had a Goan, you had a Muslim, you had one interesting part of your book is the caste discrimination faced by Ara. And they met, it leads us to the subject of your book in the next slide. They met, this group of misfits in a way, met a very interesting group of kind of misfits or outcasts in a way.
Well, they were all immigrants to Bombay.
They were immigrants to Bombay, but also they were fleeing. They were considered marginal and perhaps unwanted. And something happens in that alchemy. Can you talk about a little bit about that alchemy and how that resulted in these big name artists that we now talk about all the time?
I think they also serendipitously fit into the Nehruvian narrative of a secular India. Like you said, there was a Muslim, there was a Christian, there was a Dalit artist, Ara. I think Dadiba would be able to weigh in here why they became these seminal figures, really.
Well, can I reframe it a little bit, which is, actually, is that what happened, Dadiba? I mean, were these, my impression is that they were treated as a bit like misfits. This is why they made haste to, many of them, to leave the country. But what is the difference between these artists? What was their initial years like?
Look, none of them had it easy. Raza and Gade had come from Nagpur. Ara had come from Andhra Pradesh. Hussain had come from Indore. And Raza had come from, Souza had come from Goa. So they were all immigrants to the city. And there was a thriving art scene there, which Souza speaks of as the Bombay Art Society annual exhibition, which they were all getting a little tired of. And there were expressions amongst themselves. And there were 3 Jewish emigres in India around that same time, which really gave them a platform. So there was Rudy von Leiden, or let's start with Schlesinger. Immanuel Schlesinger was, all 3 of them had actually interned as prisoners of war because they happened to be in India when the Second World War breaks out. And that's how they met and they had sort of connects. And so the 3 of them were Rudy von Leiden, Immanuel Schlesinger, and Walter Langhammer. So Walter Langhammer was a pretty well-known painter in Austria, and an Indian student from Bombay had gone to train under him in Austria. And when she heard of the war breaking out, she invited him to come to India and sort of kind of a safe haven here. And he had a very thriving practice. He was a well-known portrait painter, as well as he became the editor, the art director of Times of India. And he then invites Rudy von Leiden, who's a critic, to be the art critic for the Times of India. And it was these 2 who sort of could nurture that sort of talent they saw in these 6. And there were others around, but the 6 of them had formed the Progressive Artist Group. The part that Schlesinger plays is of the patron, because he was the collector. he would sort of buy their works based on his own. And he was a big collector also from Austria before migrating to India. He was on his way, in fact, to Australia to take sort of citizenship there, but the war breaks out when he's in Bombay. And it was their support which gave them the encouragement, because buyers and patrons sort of frowned upon them, because it was a totally new kind of idiom, a style which they were unfamiliar with. And Rima can tell us a little more about that reaction people had to Souza's self-portrait painted in the nude. It shocked people then. But they had the support of Rudy and Langhammer, which gave them a belief to continue further.
I think, you know, when I interviewed Krishan Khanna extensively over multiple meetings, and he recalled this one incident where Souza had his these nudes displayed at the artist center, and Krishan Khanna was walking up the stairs, and he suddenly sees this woman running down, and she is screaming like she's livid, and he can't understand what has you know, fallen upon her, and she was screaming about how aghast she was viewing these nudes. And so yeah, that was one incident that Krishan Khanna recalled.
Well, the painting that we're looking at is one which earned Souza an obscenity charge. But he did paint nudes a lot, and it's quite interesting. There's a funny story by one of his neighbors who told me a similar story, which is that, I forget for what excuse, but a number of the boys found an excuse to knock on Souza's door, and they had some kind of entry into the living room. And when they were in the living room, they saw a nude painting. And so they were all very interested. They were 12 and 13 and 14-year-old boys. And Souza, noting their interest, said, "Go into the bedroom, there are several more over there." So these kids remember it very well. But the interesting thing about the milieu of this milieu is that there's a critical and also kind of support extended to them that's very unusual, that you wouldn't find even today. There's a wonderful story in your book which you highlight about Rudy von Leyden actually responding to a over-praising kind of review. Can you recall that story a little bit, please?
So there was a painting in 1963 of Souza. And while I was, you know, rummaging through the archives of the Times of India, I stumbled upon this review of Souza's work where these enormous women and a lecherous philosopher. It's a 1963 painting. And there's a response, which I thought was very interesting. And by Rudy von Leyden, who was a former critic of the Times of India. And he said, and of course the art critic in 1963 praised the work and called it the work of genius. And Rudy's response to that was, and you know, if I had to sum up the letter, that he's very well aware of Souza the person as well as the Souza the brilliant draftsman. And he's seen his work and he knows his personality. And this is not a work of genius. You know, this is his need to provoke the viewer.
It's a characteristic notably lacking in today's art world and art media, if you like. This kind of desire to be balanced instead of you know, I would say overheated market language being absorbed in all aspects of the art world. Now, this is what I would like to come back to you, Dadiba, about, which is, this is the Souza that most of us who are sitting in this audience here are familiar with. This is Souza, the commodity. This is the recognizable commodity. This is a nice work. I think it is recognizably Bombay, your area.
I think it's one of the few works that he's painted or revisited Bombay in his paintings. So he came to Bombay, but not that often.
Right.
And you see the Bombay Municipal Corporation building on the left, the Victoria Terminus on the right. But what I think he captures essentially well here is the chaos of the city with the foreground. And you get a sense of Bombay, this hustle, bustle, constant. You feel this movement, there's energy to the painting. So I think more than capturing the monuments of the building, he captures the mood of the city.
I agree. It's a very nice work. And it's in a style which is also, as we know, people can mimic this style, and there are a huge number of mediocre works purporting to be of different parts of the city. In fact, there's one...
Well, it wouldn't all fall into place done by somebody else.
No, well, maybe a number of them do. I think there's even if you look online, there's another painting purporting to be of Crawford Market by Souza, which is definitely not of Crawford Market and probably not by Souza. But in terms of Souza at 100, it's very important for us to discuss them as a commodity. And you are obviously the authority on this. As a commodity, what does Souza look like from an investment point of view, from someone who runs an auction house? What does Souza look like to you?
Well, a hot commodity. That's what I'd say. No, it's a hot commodity.
Oh, it's a hot commodity.
But that whole generation of painters, it's today that people are realizing their significance. Because I feel most artists, when they work, they're a little ahead of their times. And it takes an audience a long, long time to kind of catch up with them and even get to where they were then. And that's what's the process that's happened. You know, any change there's always initially resistance. Acceptance comes over time. And sadly, it's taken us really, really long in accepting that.
When it comes to Souza, I have to ask you about the question about fakes. Now, I know that there's ongoing litigations even, but you've been one person who's been consistently, open about the fact that a number of fake works proliferate in the Indian marketplace. I was sharing with Dadiba, I don't mind sharing with you, is that towards the end of Souza's long artistic career, I had the opportunity to help him catalog what was in his own apartment. So thousands of works, maybe 2,000 works from the 40s right up to the current day. And so I at least looked at them. And I was a young man, but I looked at...
This would have been the 1990s.
Yeah, late 90s, right? So I looked at them, those works. And I would say, from my perspective, maybe a low percentage, 10%, 5% of those were less good, relatively mediocre, nothing that really made me excited. But when I look on what's on sale in India, mainly, but when I look on sale in India, the percentage is reversed, which tells me, it doesn't pass my own personal smell test. So there's a lot of fake work going on. So in this commodity marketplace of yours, is there maybe a lack of connoisseurship or less connoisseurship than there should be?
No, that there'll always be. There's always scope for more. There's never a shortage of that. But I think what really happens in the marketplace is that everyone's looking for a good deal. And sadly, that's where people succumb to fakes or forgeries. One good aspect about public auctions is that the work is up on public display. And if anyone has a question, they're sort of open to sort of raise that. In fact, I don't say auction houses can't make mistakes. They can make mistakes. But when brought to their notice, or someone of any cognizance takes notice of something, an auction house withdraws a work if required. Till it's resolved.
There is a very, I would say, broken or inadequate correction measure. But I'll say this, the thing about Souza at 100, as I told you in the green room, is that a lot of what I see in terms of like celebrating Souza at 100 is bringing a large number of new fake works into and mainstreaming them. That's my general perspective.
Look, the number of works he did is finite.
Sure.
Several of them have changed hands over the last few decades. So how much fresh material do you really have sitting around the world? It's not very much. So if you want to do something significant on an artist, today if I went to look for an exhibition of any of these artists and bring 20 fresh works to the market, I'd find it rather difficult. Right. Unless, yes, if I was just borrowing them and if they were not for sale, much easier.
And yet, yeah, it is a conundrum. I think when we talk about Souza at 100, we have to talk about this. So these are the works that come out, in the very early period when there's a kind of cosmopolitan, early kind of embracing.
So I think this is when he's moved to Mumbai, but still memories of Goa seem to sort of dominate his work.
I think there's Goan there also, which is one of the breakthroughs that happened with Rudy von Leyden and others, is that they showed them. So this is the kind of work that I think that I'd like to ask you about, Dadiba. So Souza, even he started his career with an obscenity case. And these are the kinds of works which are still, strong signature Souzas. Is Souza still a bit too kind of what should I say, aggressive for an Indian audience? Is the Indian art buyer,
In
how are they reacting
59,
to
this would have been unacceptable, for sure.
In 59, yes.
Unacceptable. I say in 2004, partly acceptable, but still not totally acceptable. I mean, most clients would tell you, don't you have a head? Don't you have a landscape? Is this the only picture you've got?
Right.
So that still prevails.
So here,
Somebody
I want to bring
once-
up I want to actually ask you this first, is that one of the things about Souza that's at 100 is that the question and claim about misogyny, about being, it arises. People talk about him in those terms. Would you mind addressing that in maybe a painting like this as well?
I mean, once I was with an art expert, we were viewing some works at an auction recently. And she mentioned to me, and I thought was a different way to look at, was she said, I see a certain crudeness in this work. And I asked her, what do you mean by it? And she said, don't you see the gaze with which the painter would have painted this? And I think if this work was created in 2024, it would have been accepted. But who Souza was as a person, in this world of, if I may use, this hyper-wokeism, I don't think it would have passed.
What do you say, Dadiba?
I don't know, my views on this are slightly different. I don't think one needs to be too judgmental about what an artist does. The fact that we're discussing it, we're giving it credibility. So I think the work is valid, the fact that we're discussing it today.
Maybe we should recall him as a man. So we can talk about, Dadiba, you knew him, and it's 100 years, it's his 100th birthday in a way. What are your own personal experiences, something that really struck you about him?
Look, I got to know him when I was very young, and he also went on to help break that friendship we had, and which is why when I was asked a little while back what I thought about Souza, I said, a horrible man, but a painter I love. So he was super intelligent, could engage you in conversation, didn't treat me as a child, even though I was when I got to know him, I was late teens. I was hugely enamored by him. And even what he told me about painting and art, I used to be just completely awestruck. But basically, as a human being, he wasn't a very nice person. He liked confrontation, he liked problems, and he liked creating them himself. So those were aspects, but I think the man shouldn't come into his work. Finally, his work should speak for itself.
That's very interesting. I also had a similar experience, but I got to know him a few years later than you. I was in my early 20s. And actually, I was recalling to Dadiba, I had learnt about Souza here in Bombay, and I spoke to Dadiba, actually, at that time, and Dadiba gave me the impression of a man, as he did just now, of not a very nice person, or someone who might be abrasive. So when I first got to know him as a young person in New York, I had some trepidation about it. But what I recall is something very similar to Dadiba. I was blown away by how much he knew, how intelligent he was, his tremendous grasp of art history. I mean, a masterful knowledge about it. And then, of course, he was hugely entertaining, who had these very caustic observations of the world, which were very persuasive as well. We only have a minute or two, but I want to show you this. So Souza at 100, one of the things I feel good about is that he actually appeared on the digital cover of appropriately named Hype, the editors here, Che Korean. But I was happy about that because Souza's grandson, who's a very talented artist, painted him, actually, Souza, in the 40s. And so this is the man this is from his passport, I think it's from his passport photograph when he goes to the US. So it's about 48, 49, the same kind of person that we're talking about now. And, he has enough relevance that we're talking about him. Now, I want to end with you, if you don't mind, Rima, which is that For you, as a kind of representative of a younger generation than Dadiba and myself, what's the relevance of Souza? At Souza at 100, is it like, is it going to be a lasting thing? What has he made it?
Well, of course, like Dadiba said, he is hot commodity. But I think along with Souza, what's equally remarkable is that another Goan artist, V.S. Gaitonde, also turns 100 this year. And so does Mohan Samant, K.G. Subramanian, Souza, Ram Kumar. And, as, if I may add, as the editor of Art India, felt these artists have been written about numerous times. But it did feel that, there's a rare moment when in 1 year, 5 master painters, complete a century. And we've done that. We have commemorated this in our upcoming issue as well. As an artist, yes, Souza counts. What he did by forming the Bombay Progressive Artists Group, which I arguably it is the most important art movement in, in an independent India, that where the onus, like I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, was this narrative about new India was on the artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers. If you see the kind of films that were coming out in 1950s, the music or the literature, it was about building upon this new India narrative. And I think, yes, credit where it's due that they did make that effort. And I feel as an artist, yes, he counts. As a person, there's much to talk about.